If you're looking for Irish records that were created prior to 1922, then you're in the right place. Today we are talking about the Beyond 2022 Ireland Project, which may just be the best hope for Irish research in a long time. Dr. Brian Gurin is here, and he's a specialist on Irish census records and substitutes. He's also the author of the books Pre-Census Sources for Irish Demography and the Irish Religious Censuses of the 1760s. And he's here today to tell us about this exciting project. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lisa. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be able to talk about Beyond 2022.
I think this is going to be really exciting, and I don't know how many people really are familiar with this project. I kind of stumbled into it recently, and I got to tell you, I am really enthusiastic about it. I'd love to have you give us some of the backstory and answer some of our questions. So let's jump into it. I'll have you share your screen, and let's talk about, when we think of Irish records, we think of the Public Records Office of Ireland, of course. So I'd love to have you kind of start us off with what was held at the Public Records Office of Ireland prior to 1922. What kind of records would somebody have found there?
Great. Well, the Public Record Office opened its doors in 1867. And prior to that, the Irish records, the various state records, records of Parliament and so on, they were dispersed around in various repositories around Dublin and around the country. And many of them were stored in locations that were unsuitable for maintaining records in good condition. The records were getting damaged. Some records were getting damaged by damp and so on. So the Public Record Office opened in 1867. And they started to take in records from these unsuitable repositories. The records that were available in the Public Record Office, there was a vast quantity of records available. There were our earliest census records. Our first census was held in 1813. That wasn't a particularly successful census, and then our next census was the first time that Ireland was fully enumerated by a statutory census in 1821, and thereafter we held censuses every 10 years on a year, the terminal digit 1. So we held our census in 1821, 31, 41, 51, and so on, right up to 1911, which was the last census that was held in Ireland when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. So they were very important for genealogists. And an interesting thing about the census, when the Public Record Office opened, and it just goes to show how research has changed, they published annual reports every year, the Deputy Keeper's reports. And when they opened, one of the early reports, I think it might have been the second report or the third report, made a comment about the census records, and it talked about these census records were just clutter, taking up space, that they weren't very important, and they were just taking up an inordinate amount of space in the Public Record Office, and they didn't want to receive any more census records because they were just basically clutter. And when you think about the census and how important the census is for genealogical research and family history research now, it just goes to show how historical research has changed, and how these records are vital records now for historical research and historical study. Other records that had state papers, various records of state, of the administration, of how the government worked. The records of the Irish Parliament. Ireland had its own Parliament up until 1800, and then it became part of the United Kingdom on the 1st of January 1801, and that was the closing of the Irish Parliament. But all the parliamentary records were there, so any parliamentary inquiry that was initiated prior to 1801 was in the Parliamentary Records Collection, which was moved to the Public Record Office. And really, this is really a story of great irony, because the story of the Public Record Office, because the county records were moved in there in after 1891, when a fire in the courthouse down in County Cork, in Cork City, destroyed the records for the local government records for Cork, many of the local government records for Cork. And the Public Record Office decided that to ensure that something like that couldn't happen, they instructed that county records be received in. So from 1891, county records started to be transferred in to ensure their safekeeping. And of course, the great irony is that then when the Public Record Office was destroyed, that those records were lost. Corporation records, records of towns were in there, maps, wills, testamentary records, records of the established church, which was the Church of Ireland Church. It was the official state church. So their parish records, many of the parish records were moved in there. Taxation records like the hearth tax, which was a tax on fireplaces, requiring the payment of 2 shillings per hearth or per fireplace in your house from 1662 until into the 19th century. They were in there, and these would have contained the list of names of people paying the hearth tax record. So it was a really vast collection. It was a really big big archive, and it built up from 1867 right up to 1922, still receiving records into the record office. And of course, the great tragedy then, and in fact, it was really successful. If I just go back and talk about the 1821 census again, Ireland's first census, when that census was held, the census recorded the names of all householders in the country, but also the act that initiated the census specified that each of the counties, the individual counties, were to make a copy of the census as well, to have to have locally, to hold locally as their own local copy of the census. But then when the county records came in after 1891, after the fire down in Cork Courthouse, all those copies of the 1821 census also came into the Public Record Office as part of the county records collection. And then in 1922, what happened in 1922? In 1922, the Civil War commenced, and the Public Record, the Public Record Office was on the north side of Dublin City in the Four Courts complex, the court complex, just north of the Liffey, on the River Liffey, on the north bank, and the anti-treaty IRA occupied the Four Courts complex, and we're not sure we're still not sure what happened. There are two schools of thought. One is that the anti-treaty IRA deliberately mined the building and blew up the building when they were evacuating it to destroy the records, which were primarily records of British administration in Ireland. So it was a great strike for Irish republicanism, destroying the records of British administration in Ireland. The second thought on it is that when the shelling started, when the anti-treaty IRA started shelling the Four Courts complex to drive out the anti-treaty Republican forces there, that a shell went into the Public Record Office, exploded munitions that were stored in the Public Record Office. But whatever happened, it's a moot point now, but whatever happened, it was quite a disaster for Irish record keeping. The beautiful, fantastic archive was destroyed. It was explosions occurred on the 30th of June 1922, and it was a catastrophe for Irish history. The building was destroyed. This beautiful archive was destroyed. Records going back 800 years blown up. The records were scattered around Dublin City. Records were blown on the wind over 10 miles out around Dublin. People were picking them up and handing them back in. There was very little handed back in. It was a catastrophe for Ireland, and a really great tragedy. So that's the backstory, Lisa, and I'll just give you a quick look at the building itself. That's the inside of the building, and the building was split up. If I just show you this slide here, right? There was two parts to the record office. They were really when in designing this, they were really careful to try to ensure that no catastrophe could happen, that these records couldn't be destroyed. So there were two parts to the building. The building there, you can see that kind of squarish type building on the left. That's called the record house, and that was where the researchers went. So if you wanted to use if you wanted to access records, you went into the record house. It was like the reading room of the archive, and you filled out your form. You filled out the details of what record you wanted. The building on the right then is called the Record Treasury, and it was called the Treasury because these were Ireland's treasures. So this was where Ireland's treasures were stored, our beautiful archives, our beautiful records of Irish history over 800 years. And if you look down between the if you look up at the very up towards the roof between the two buildings, you can see a gap. This was a fire break that was installed because it was thought that if any fire broke out, it wasn't going to break out in the record treasury. It was going to break out in the record house where the public came in and where the heating systems were. So they wanted to ensure that the records, all the collection of records that were in the record treasury, were going to be protected from fire. So that building isn't actually joined together. That's a false wall there, just there. And that's a gap. There was this fire break gap between the two buildings to ensure that there was no possibility that a fire could spread from the record house into the record treasury and destroy the records. And the great irony then is that when the fire broke out, when the explosions occurred, they occurred in the record treasury. And that meant that the fire break operated in reverse, protecting the record house from the treasury. And by coincidence, then, if people were working on records, they were stored. If people were working on records, whoever was working on records on the day that the record office was occupied, those records were moved from the treasury into the record house for them to access. And those records remained in the record house. So a small quantity of records survived just by pure accident because people were using them in the record house at the time that the anti-treaty forces occupied them. So the firebreak operated in reverse, protecting the record house from the fire that was in the record treasury, even though it was designed with the idea that it would protect the treasury from any fire that was going to occur in the
Oh,
record
yeah. I
house.
mean, it sounds like they were really giving a lot of thought to protecting them. Did you say that there was actually munitions stored there, or was that just a hypothesis? They were just guessing maybe that that's what was happening.
There was, but just to take up on the first question there, yes, they did. They were really careful to ensure that no damage could come to the records through fire. That they didn't just, it wasn't just that they installed this fire break, but they also made sure that there was no wood in the record
Right.
treasury to ensure that there was no possibility at all. So everything was metal. And initially there were wooden shelves in there, but then about a couple of years, maybe 10, 15 years in, the deputy keeper's reports, the annual report says, right, that's it. There's no wood left in here. We have it perfectly protected. There's no possibility of fire occurring in here. So they were really careful to ensure that there was no possibility at all. And that's a view inside the record treasury there. So that's what it looked like. There were 6 floors in that building, and you won't see any wood at all. These people along here, the people here, this is a staged photograph now, but these people are called searchers. So you go into the record house, that's that there. So this is where you as a researcher would go. You'd sit down on one of those benches down the back, you'd fill out your document, and you'd hand it up to the clerks behind the desk. They'd give it to one of these searchers who'd go in through those double doors there. That's the way in between the fire break and the link into the record treasury. So they'd go in there, through into the record treasury, wander up to the steps to whichever floor the record was on, find the record for you, bring it back down and through into the record house for you.
Wow.
So that's one of the few views that we have inside the record treasury. It was a staged photograph that was taken just to view it, but you can see no wood at all. It's all metal. It's all to ensure that there was no possibility of fire in there. Now we do have a great a great knowledge of what was in it. We know a lot of what was in the record house. This is there was in the record treasury there was a kind of a central aisle down, and then on either side there were what were called bays. There were 6 floors to it, so you can see there 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this is giving you an indication of what was in it, what type of, just the principal records that were in each of the bays. So again, if I go back to my 1821 census that I was talking about, that was right up there on floor 6 in Bay I. The census for 1821, 1831, and 1840 and 1841, the census records were stored up there. We know exactly where they were. We know exactly what books were there. And in the next bay, 6K, census records for 1841 and 1851. So we know where they were. We know where everything was within the record house. We know where all the records were stored. This is only one side of it. So if you take that central aisle, this is the east side, and then so there's six stories, and there's 10 bays long. So there's 60 bays on one side of the aisle over the 6 floors, and then there's another 60 bays on the other side, all easily accessible. Now, if I wanted a record, if I wanted a census record, well, I know that the record was in 6I, so that's what I'd fill down in my document, and I'd put down the specifics of it. And if I take this one here, this is an interesting one. This is 6E. It's Customs House collection, and it's collector's accounts. Okay, so 6E. And if I jump on here, this is a PRO, a Public Record Office inspection document. It was filled out on the 26th of February 1918 by a gentleman called Tennyson Groves, who's a great hero of mine. Tennyson Groves was a genealogist who sat in the Public Record Office and transcribed vast amounts of information from various census records. And a lot of what we have surviving now are transcripts that were transcribed by Tennyson Groves. So Tennyson Groves on the 26th of February 1918 was looking for collector's accounts. So there's what he filled out on his document. 26th of February 1918, collector's accounts for Londonderry, 1690, and he filled out the location for it, 6E, Shelf Tree, location number 4. So if the Public Record Office still existed now, and you went up to floor 6 and went into the E bay on floor 6, there'd be shelves there, and if you go to the 3rd shelf on that and work along to the 4th item on that shelf, it would be the collector's accounts for Londonderry. It was that simple, and there's Grove's signature, of course, down here. It was that simple. It was really, really well organized, really, really accessible. There were fantastic indexes that were produced for the records, very easy to find, and it was all just specified by 3 different components to get to a particular record: the bay, 6E in this case, the shelf, number 3, and the location on the shelf, number 4. And it was just that simple. Brilliant indexes that we had for these records to allow us to allow them to be accessed prior to 1922. So it really was one of the great tragedies. It was a real tragedy of Irish history that this archive was just.
Well, and they were doing everything right. That's the thing I'm hearing, is they really were doing everything right. I'm interested, before we kind of talk about how they dealt with the loss at the time, and then what we're doing today is, you mentioned about the copies, and that happens. We see that in genealogical records around the world, that sometimes copies get made, and then the original set maybe goes to a central location, and then you keep the local set. Do you have a sense of, you mentioned that some of the census records, they actually sent the second set into the Public Records Office as well. Do you have a sense of how many duplicates are out there? I mean, how much hope was there that there's copies of so many things that were in the building that were lost on that day?
That's a really good question. I do want to go back to another question that you asked me, which I haven't answered yet. Was there munitions in there? Yes, there was, because this was the anti-treaty IRA who occupied the forecourt and had munitions stored in there. So it was the Civil War started on the 28th of June. So there were 2 armies ready to fight each other, and they had munitions stored in there. So yes, there was. But in terms of copies, yeah, look, this was the Public Record Office was really, really successful. And they did, as you say, they did everything right. They had everything fireproofed really, really well. But they were also really successful in ensuring that they were very thorough in taking in all records that they had responsibility for. And once the fire occurred in the courthouse in 1891 down in Cork, they said, right, we can't have a situation where local records are stored in unsuitable accommodation like this that can be destroyed. So we have a perfectly fireproof location here, so we're going to take them all in. So whatever counties produced, like as I said, the 1821 census required counties to produce copies. Now, not all counties produced copies, and not all counties produced complete copies for their county, but many counties did, and many counties produced partial copies. All of those went into the Public Record Office after 1891 as per the instructions of the Public Record Office. They all went in except for the copies for one county, which is County Cavan, and about 40% of the census survives for Cavan. As the local copy. So they were the only county that didn't send in their local copies into the record office. All the others transferred them in. I live in County Wicklow, which is just south of Dublin. And looking at the deputy keeper's report, I see a note where Wicklow sent in their census records. And I would love to have the census records for Wicklow. And if the fire, it was just by coincidence, if the fire hadn't occurred in Cork, maybe the Public Record Office would have left the records stay locally, and they would have survived then. But yeah, it's in terms of survival of records, Cavan is the only county that copies of the 1821 census survive. Now, there are 4 volumes of 1821 census, original volumes surviving. Like some bits have survived, bits of partial sets of records have survived. So there's 4 volumes surviving from 1821, original volumes. That's 4 out of 480 original volumes that there was. So it's like about 1% of 1821, the original volumes from 1821 survive. But for Cavan, 40% of the county is covered by copies that were made under the terms of the Census Act. And then there are transcripts for various parts, like genealogists, local historians. As they, prior to 1922, they made copies. But in terms of survival, there's probably about, I suppose, 60,000 names surviving from 1821 in transcripts. Now that's 50 or 60,000 names out of the 6.8 million names that were enumerated in 1821. So it's really, really tragic. And it's even worse as you go to the next census for 1831. The survival rate is even lower, and for 1841 it's very low as well. There are about 2,500 civil parishes in Ireland, and for 1841 there's only one parish that the original record survived for. So that's 1 out of 2,500. Like the scale of the loss is just catastrophic. But we are very lucky in that we do have census substitutes in some instances. We have a wonderful land valuation, taxation valuation that was conducted in the 1850s called Griffith's valuation, which is effectively a census substitute. But that's what we're down to as Irish genealogists. We're down to using census substitutes in a lot of instances, because unfortunately, this wonderful census records that we had magnificent census records, and so much of them were lost. There was one other very interesting census that was conducted in Ireland in 1766, a religious census, and that's a real focus of our project now, because it's a magnificent record. A magnificent survey that was conducted. That is the second book of mine that you mentioned, and some original records survive from that as well. So that's a really interesting focus of our project, which I could talk for hours about.
Before we talk about beyond 2022 and what you're doing today to kind of reconstruct it, between 1922 and today, what did they do? And whether it's the census or whether it was tax records or other types of records, how has this been coped with over the last 100 years? Were there projects, were there efforts to try to
Yeah.
reconstruct and do, fill it back in?
Yeah, there were initially, as soon as the record office was reconstructed, and after it, they did put out calls for records, and records came in, transcripts that were taken, official copies that were taken before 1922 came back in, were donated back into the record office. So they did make efforts to recover them. A lot of the records, like the charred remains of records that were picked up around the streets of Dublin and in the vicinity of the forecourt, were collected. As many as could be collected were collected and boxed and catalogued and so on. Many of them, many of those records weren't accessed again until our project started, and the National Archives has been cataloguing those records that were picked up almost 100 years ago on the streets of Dublin. They've been cataloguing them. They've been trying to recover them, to kind of try to treat them, to make them accessible again. So, but there were various efforts made. Donations came in from genealogists. Like, we had a lot of genealogists who transcribed records previous to 1922. So the government, if genealogical transcripts came up in auctions, the government was very active in trying to secure those. So they did as much as they could do, I think, to try to recover the losses. But it was only going to be a drop in the ocean in comparison with what was there.
So now you've got a brand new project. It's Project 2022. Tell us how this gets started and what's your end goal?
It's part of the decade of centenaries. There's a decade of centenaries in Ireland, where there was a lot of things happening around 1916 with an Easter Rising, around 1918 with a general election which saw Sinn Féin win the majority of the seats. It saw the War of Independence, the Civil War. And then the partition of Ireland, the government of Ireland Act and the partition of Ireland. So there's a lot of things happening around there. So there's this decade of centenaries that has been going on for the past number of years. 10 years of centenaries, and beyond 2022 really fits into that as a part of the decade of centenaries. 2-year project that's been going on with the intention of identifying material that still exists in archives around the world, and in local archives here in Ireland, to recover it, to make it available digitally, online, open access, freely available. There's no charges, there's no firewalls or anything like that. This is trying to make these records available as widely as possible, and make them as accessible as possible. So they're being digitally imaged, high quality digital images. They are being transcribed as much as possible, right? And that's not being hand transcribed. This is a transcription package which is reading the handwriting. That's mostly all handwriting. There's some typed as well, but it's mostly handwriting. Reading the handwriting and trying to transcribe that handwriting into searchable text. So at the end of it, it is the intention of the project was to make 50 million words available, searchable, through the Beyond 2022 website, and that'll be achieved. So you will be able to enter a name, enter a townland name, enter a place name, enter free text, and search these documents and come back with whatever we have. But it really is a wonderful project, I think, and I think it's a real testament that it's being made freely available, that it's not behind any paywall or anything like that. We're very lucky in Ireland in that a lot of our, say, our genealogical resources are freely available. Our two censuses that are fully available are 1901 and 1911. They're available, searchable online. Our civil registration is available, searchable online from 1864. Our Griffiths valuations, this is this census substitute for the 1850s, available online, and our plenty of our records are available, freely searchable online, and beyond 2022 is going to be the same. So it's going to be really exciting, and I do think I do think there's going to be a lot of momentum building up as we get near to the launch date on the 30th of June this year.
So this is beyond2022.ie. Can you give us a kind of a description, a little peek at what we might experience when we go to that website? And it really is kind of like virtually recreating the building, isn't it?
Yes, it's recreating the building. We're trying to give a view of the building, what it looked like, where the records were, positioning the records on shelves. So that's what we're trying to do. It's trying to make everything as accessible as possible through the website. Make it as accessible as possible. You'll be able to search. You'll be able to browse.
Does it have kind of a genealogy focus, or is it really more of a governmental records kind of focus?
There are three gold seams, what we call gold seams. These are really sources that we're putting a lot of attention into. One is a medieval gold seam, recreating medieval accounts. A second is a Commonwealth and Protectorate gold seam focusing on the 1650s. And the gold seam that I'm working on is the census records gold seam, trying to recover the census records or recover census records.
Well, it sounds like you and your whole team are doing an amazing job thinking about the future and how people are going to be able to access information, but also making it available today. And Beyond 2022 just sounds like an amazing project. I love the virtual physical building of it that we're going to be able to visit, as well as digging into the records and seeing what machine learning and OCR and AI can do to help extract all that information. The website is beyond2022.ie. And Dr. Brian Gurin, thank you so much. This has been exhilarating to hear about what's coming very soon. Thank you so much.
There's our website. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Instagram. It's very exciting. So it'd be great if we get some more followers. Keep an eye on it. We're always interested to hear from researchers, and hopefully in June of this year, we're going to have a really exciting launch. Very exciting.
It sounds
Lisa, it was a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.